Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Sony a7S Mark III. Now, the first thing I'll tell you about this roughly $3,500 full-frame camera is that it is the best product of its kind ever made. So if you're looking to shoot video 4K, 120 frames per second, 10-bit, that is 422, Sony's never done it before, and quite frankly, you're not going to find it anywhere else in terms of being able to record that sort of quality internally. So that's the first thing you should know about the a7S Mark III. It is unmatched in that realm. But I will tell you, and this is part of the reason I'm not upgrading to it personally, is that it does live in somewhat of a gray space. I haven't heard many people say this, but I'm going out there. I'm saying it. Because the fact that it shoots such amazing video, has active steady shot, has the new flip out display, which is very versatile. It has the best EVF ever made. Autofocus is unparalleled. The best autofocus on any camera basically on Earth, but just happens to be able to shoot some of the best 4K video footage out there. It can't write to an NVMe drive. So traditional cinema cameras, that's something you're going to find. For some reason, Sony opted not to provide the bandwidth you would need to do that here in their I/O, and that's something that I'm not going to give them hell for, but it's something that I think most cinematographers that are picking this camera up would like to be able to do. Haven't heard a lot of people say that, but I'm saying it here. So even though it has a Type-C port, the throughput isn't going to let you record to an external NVMe drive, which of course most cinema cameras do permit you to do. So that irks me a little bit. It's not a game breaker because, quite frankly, it's great to be able to record internally, but where does that leave you? It means that you're going to have to use, if you want 4K 60, at least a V60 card, and if you want any resolution beyond that, meaning 4K 120, you're going to be looking at V90 cards. So keep that in mind. If you want the zero compromise solution, though, you're going to have to use Sony's own tough compact flash express type A cards. You can see I have one here that was sent for review, and this is really the ideal solution, but it is very expensive. This is an 80 gig card. It retails for $200 US. If you want to be able to leverage the entire or the full capability of the card, you'll want to pick up the reader that they make as well. 800 on the read, 700 megabytes on the write. I mean, that's insane. This is essentially an NVMe that goes into the camera. So kudos to doing that. But I feel like Sony's forcing their hand on this because even though they've gifted us another thing that I think everyone was waiting for, which is a full-size HDMI port, you will not be able to capture beyond 4K 60p, but thankfully you will get 12-bit. So that's really nice. Even though the video it shoots is pretty much unmatched, the color science, the autofocus, again, the fact that it even can pull off 120 frames in UHD internally is amazing, but a little bit of a head scratcher that we can't record to an NVMe drive and that the external output through HDMI is limited. So it does feel like Sony is pushing us to go down this road, and you can buy their regular tough line of cards. You don't have to buy in to the most expensive solution right now, which is this one. And 80 gigs doesn't afford you that much time. You're looking at 45 minutes. You can, as I mentioned, go to the 160 gig card, which will give you double that, but it's $400 US. And clearly, had they made the Type-C port capable or competent enough to deliver the bandwidth necessary to write to an NVMe drive, I wouldn't be talking about this. So that's my first real true gripe with this camera. So it's video editing and the inability to use NVMe drives. If we had that, which I think would be easy for Sony to implement, this would just be, I really wouldn't have much to talk about in this video, and I likely would be considering upgrading to this. For me personally, I can't see picking this up to upgrade the content I shoot for all of you. I'm not a filmmaker, and I think the fact that it has those limitations do give filmmakers a hurdle. It doesn't make it unusable, of course. Now, focusing on what is amazing, throwing on this little shotgun, which I've been using since it came out with my A7R4, here you get the same performance, which is just really best in class, no wires, no batteries. Of course, it's using the internal battery for the camera, but it's fantastic. The same goes with the Bluetooth grip. Just a great tool to have, whether you have the camera mounted on it or not. This is a dream pairing, and if you pick up an a7S III, I can't imagine why you wouldn't buy these. Even if you're just going to use this as a remote for half the time, it's still so versatile and works across so many of Sony's, at least latest gen cameras. It's a no-brainer at now, I think it's 100 US. This is 300. I think it originally launched at 350. This cannot work on many cameras though, that being the shotgun mic. This and the a7R4 and the A9 Mark II are the only cameras where this will work natively without going to analog, so keep that in mind. Now, in terms of other things you should be aware of about the a7S Mark III, I've talked about the video performance. I haven't talked about high frame rate. So 240 frames in HD, another great feature of this camera, but not a primary reason for purchase. You don't need to use G Master lenses, but of course, you're going to get your best fidelity out of G Master. Now, I'm going to tell you what I've tested on it besides the GM, which predominantly lived on it through the course of this review. I did also test, as I excuse my reach here, my 100 to 400. Amazing results. I mean, the dynamic range that this camera is capable of is bonkers. But while I can brag about that, and another lens I loved shooting with was my 28 to 135. This is an f4 servo, so you do have power zoom on this, which a lot of people are going to say you don't need, and I completely understand, but for my use, I love this lens. It's one of my favorite E-mount pieces of glass. I asked Sony to send along the newer version of this, which is APS-C. Of course, the thing you have to realize about the a7S Mark III is that APS-C will work, but only in full HD, and that's because we're working with a 12 megapixel sensor. So while this was still a great pairing for, again, understanding the limitations that I could get the 240 frames per second in full HD, and I could shoot great looking full HD video with this lens, because it's APS-C, no 4K is happening, and that's because of the resolution afforded by the a7S Mark III. So traditionally speaking, when you think of cinema cameras, when you think of even previous gen A-series cameras, if I talk about the A7 R4 that I have right here, and that's my primary, or my A7 R2, or the A7 III, those are all downsampling, right? They have higher resolution sensors than this. And what that means is that in APS-C mode, you can still record 4K, but because we're working with 12 megapixels here, it just isn't going to happen. So I think that's important to point out. It's not a flaw of this camera, but again, very intentional in that Sony is making it clear this shines in full frame. It's all about zero pixel binning, and that's exactly what this camera does. But I have to say, miss the flexibility of using APS-C glass. It's not a complaint, it's just a commentary. Again, it's meant to be a full frame 4K video camera, and that's exactly what it is. You may have noticed I'm permanently here on the mode dial in video mode, and for good reason. Now, the S&Q is great as well. I mean, that's your high frame rate or slow motion, however you want to look at it. But for me, this was all about the 4K 120. I mean, that is the beauty of this camera. And again, as much as I've complained about not being able to write NVMe, plenty of cinematographers and videographers are going to say the beauty of this is not needing an NVMe. And I agree, but from an economic standpoint, of course, having a 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, or 4 terabyte, or 8 terabyte NVMe makes for a really nice pairing that I just wish we had the flexibility. But again, the beauty is the internal recording is happening without true overheating. Now, I say true overheating because if you've caught my coverage thus far, the camera will overheat, but you can lift the threshold. This is not a new thing with Sony, and that means continuous recording will continue on. But the reason I pointed out the video setting on the dial here is because I'm not really using anything else. And that's something where I don't think Sony took the right approach with this body, being that it is their best video camera, again, in their E-mount lineup, specifically the Alpha E-mount lineup, because it's not, it's still meant to sit somewhere in a hybrid world, even though I don't look at it that way. it just isn't as video-centric as you might have imagined when it comes to controls, and that's not intuitive. They relocated the video record button to here, which I got used to fairly quickly, and I do like it. I was accustomed to the video record button being where the C1 is right now, and I do kind of prefer that, but I guess it's a wash in terms of personal preference. The point I'm making here is that all of these modes make me feel like we're still looking at a still camera. And at the end of the day, I don't see the a7S Mark III as a still camera. It's a video camera that can take stills, but I would never tell someone to buy this as their still camera. And it's not because 12 megapixels isn't enough, it's just that it's a video camera. There's really no two ways about this. When we talk about the new menu system, it's really good. There's no question about it. I mean, it is a whole nother level for Sony, and I see it as a starting point. I want to see them flesh this out. I'm excited to see how it transforms their camera line, but I still feel like Sony is capable of so much more. How do I know? Look at their Xperia line of phones. If they were to integrate what they're doing with the Xperia line of phones into their Alpha Series cameras, they would get so much praise, they'd be printing money. I mean, they're printing money with this model alone, just because of its video capability. Now imagine that you have all of the goodness that their Xperia line has matured into, built into this camera, not just for the menu system, but the touchscreen performance. I think a larger screen would have done this camera a whole lot of good. I mean, we have this amazing EVF, which people may or may not use. They absolutely are going to use this touchscreen, and it still is just meager for what could be coming out of Sony. I mean, Sony is one of the most dynamic corporations on planet Earth, and they have the ability to make this thing magical. They just haven't done it yet. So let's hope that that does come. Now, when it comes to bandwidth, I talked a little bit about the SD cards, and that's another reason I wish we had the ability to record to an NVMe, and that's because the bitrate on here does get insane. We're talking about 600 insane, and they've flexed their codecs. H.265 is alive and well. For those of you wondering whether or not you're going to be able to edit that and whether you'll need a new PC, the answer is likely yes. If you have to ask that question, you probably are going to need new hardware. I would tell you otherwise if that were the case. It just isn't. These are, not enormous files, like they're not anywhere near as large as what comes out of the Sigma FP, but the Sigma FP is recording 12-bit to NVMEs, and yeah, it's not doing 4K at even 60 frames per second, but still, it's something you must be aware of. I do really like the flexibility of the fully articulating display. I mean, Sony should have done this years ago. I got so accustomed to their traditional back mount that I wasn't blown away when I first saw this brought to market, but now I am sold on it. I mean, there's really no downside at all. It allows you to get into spots that you wouldn't be able to otherwise to see the display. So there's no going back for me from this. I cannot wait to see this feature implemented into the A7R5. And just like I believe we'll see 4K 60 on the A7R5 as well as the A7 IV, I mean, I may be wrong, but I think that's where we're going to come in. And that's going to be the sort of camera that I personally want. The hybrid that gives you incredible still imaging along with incredible video. And for me, my channel, my personal use, I really feel that 4K 60 is enough. Do I love having access to the 120? Yeah, it's great. Do I need it? No. So that's where, for me, I feel like this camera is a little bit ahead of its time. I think the SD cards also tell that story, that the internal storage or the internal writing capability really isn't quite there. I mean, it's there if you go Sony's route, and you can get more affordable options, again, in a traditional SD card, the V60 and V90s, but I just feel like we aren't there yet. I mean, I think the largest capacity traditional SD card that you could throw in here to capture the 4K 120, you're looking at, I think it's 256 gigs. So again, I'm a little bit spoiled on that side of things. I like shooting with either a 0.5 terabyte or a terabyte SD card, but it's just not possible here. It doesn't exist. And that's why I wish the NVMEs existed. People are going to think I'm talking about that way too much, and it's a side note, but I just kind of gave you a very solid reason why I personally would prefer to have that out there. It's not just about affordability, it's about actual existence. Something to be aware of. Ergonomics on this thing are great. If you're recording externally, you're not going to run into overheating. I did test that. I don't have a Ninja, and I'm not saying you should run out and buy one, because remember, the Ninja is not going to let you record from that HDMI port at 120 frames per second. You will be limited to 60. So this camera Sony clearly wants to keep it internal, and I give them kudos for it, because that's not something you really see. I mean, again, cinema cameras will not let you do that. So Sony's done something that really no one else is doing right, and Canon solutions are overheating monsters. So once you lift the threshold on this, you're not going to have any overheating issues, but keep in mind that I do still worry about wear and tear on the internals. Some of you have pointed out and mentioned that you think that it's really just a matter of how hot it's going to get to the touch, and I do hope that that is the case. I will not be able to ever verify that, though, at least right now, because I've had my 2 weeks with this camera. It's going back to Sony. It is a review unit, and that's it. Now, if I owned it, I would have a long-term review, and of course, I'd revisit it over 6 months, over a year, 2 years possibly, because look, this is the first update in 5 years to the a7S, which everyone was waiting for. And I think Sony hit it out of the park. The things I'm pointing out are just things that I feel are missing, and I'm certainly not every shooter out there that wants to pick this up. But this is my review, and that's where things lie for me with the a7S Mark III. So again, this is the best camera of its kind. If you're looking for full frame, if you're looking for no pixel binning and color science and autofocus that are unmatched when it comes to video in a form factor that is also unmatched, you're going to get it. It's going to be expensive, even though the body alone is not. I don't think $3,500 is a ransom in any way, shape, or form. But again, I've pointed out the things that I wish it had that it doesn't. I don't think any of those are game breakers. I'm not doing as deep a dive as cinematographers or videographers alike would probably give you, and you've probably watched those videos already, but that's just my own personal experience with it. So again, I have no reservations about recommending this camera. Like many of Sony's full-frame cameras, it's one of the best pieces of technology of 2020, and as I've said, these are no-brainers. I would buy them instantly for this. I did buy them instantly pretty much for my a7R4, so that tells you what you need to know. Now, comparing it to the a7R4, that's something I'll save for, that's a separate video altogether. But there are clear advantages here and disadvantages, and that's because it's not a hybrid, as I've been saying over and over again through the course of this video. Another lens that I shot on here that I love is, and this is a lens that's generally loved, it's not just special to me, is the 24-105 f4. This is an affordable piece of glass. It is incredibly well suited for both still and video, and of course has optical steady shot on board. And that's something I want to talk about. When it comes to stabilization, this camera does give us active steady shot, and it's a blessing. If you're shooting handheld stuff, if you're vlogging, and I don't think you need to buy this to vlog. Something like Sony's ZV-1 is more than enough for vlogging, but if that is the route you want to go, active steady shot is great. But if we're talking about telephoto, I brought out the 100 to 400 G Master. If you're shooting this and you're off tripod, keep the active steady shot off. The active steady shot, crops in, and essentially it trying to handle your hand motion. The instability of handheld operation is going to essentially screw up any true telephoto shots that you'd be pulling off with this camera. So you're better off keeping that off. And when you are shooting at 120 frames per second, there already is a crop happening. I think it's 10%, something to that effect. Active steady shot requires also 10%. That's why they don't coexist. So traditional steady shot is what you'll be using if you are looking for stabilization. Of course, your best video is going to be with no stabilization, and that's going to be either putting this on a gimbal, which this is ideal for, or, of course, having it on a tripod, which it's also ideal for. But its form factor is really the key to this camera's success, besides its raw performance straight out of camera. Of course, if you're looking for log, it's there, and you're going to use it. It's going to be your best really choice when using this in terms of giving you the most leverage over what you've captured. But again, if you're not familiar with log, S-Log, and any of, LUTs or anything like that, do you really need this camera? Again, I have to say you probably don't. And I don't want people to get sucked in by hype. It happens too often. That doesn't mean this isn't the best camera of its kind. I've already stated over and over again, it is. The question is, do you need the best camera of this kind? And that really depends on what you're using it for. I've already stated for my channel and going on screen, which I plan to do soon, I don't see this being a major difference maker. Granted, 8-bit versus 10-bit, like what I could shoot with the A7R2, or I have over here the A7R4 in its cage, excuse the cage. Both of these guys are going to produce great video. Now, will it come close to the 10-bit that thing can output? No, it's not going to be up to snuff with it, but it's going to be really close. And for the majority of users who aren't producing a feature film, who are not making a living shooting video, it's not going to be a game changer. Granted, the 120 frames per second, again, still is amazing, and the 240 in full HD is also amazing. But do they need that? Probably not. And that's why I feel like I'm not a voice of reason, but and I'm not a voice of dissent here or contention, but it's just stuff you need to be aware of, that even though this is an amazing camera that, again, internally can record what everyone wishes we could all do, limitations exist. And it may be, most likely is, overkill for the majority of you. I'm shocked by how many YouTubers are adopting it, but also not. And the reason is because if you are making your living on YouTube, it makes sense to have the best autofocus video camera of its kind, and that's where this falls. You don't need a cinema camera to shoot for YouTube, and yet this is, Netflix certified, and so in a way it looks, feels, and performs like a cinema camera. So these are just things you need to be aware of. I don't think anyone is going to purchase this and be disappointed. From a still standpoint, I do think that it's an underperformer. But what are your expectations? If you're coming from the previous gen A7S, the 1 or the 2, I'll make it, that was all about being the camera that could shoot in the dark. The thing here is that you can now pretty much do that with the A7 III and even the A7R4, even though, of course, the 61 plus megapixels there creates a lot of noise, so that's not a good comparison. But when comparing this to the A7 III, low light shooting is no longer the specialty of the A7S. It is strictly video. So if you're getting this thinking, I need to have the A7S because I want to shoot in the dark, this will perform pretty much better than anything else on the market. But how much better is it than the A7 III? Not that much better. So I can't make the argument there. And of course, when it comes to megapixels, because we're only dealing with 12 on that full frame sensor, if you like to crop on video, which a lot of people do in their edits, you're not going to have as much information. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. So a lot of cinema cameras that record at 6K, you have more information there. In fact, even dealing with something like the A7R4, which again has that 61 megapixel sensor, cropping on 4K 30 video here, I'm going to have more information than I will with this. So again, it's just something to know. I'm not saying that the A7R4 is a better video camera. No one should misinterpret it as such. It is not. It isn't. It's close, but it's not. It's an 8-bit camera, apples and oranges. But again, if you're going to crop in on anything, you're going to lose information inherently because you're starting at 12 megapixels and you're now working your way down. With any other camera from Sony that I've mentioned, again, the A7 III or the R4 that I brought into frame, I don't have the A7 III, but I reviewed it, I used it, considered owning it, and it is a great hybrid. It needs to be replaced, of course, in the lineup, and it's being pushed heavily on sale right now. That was an email I got from Sony today about the hard push, and that tells me the A7 IV probably isn't so far away. You have to remember that 24 megapixels is what you're sitting with in an A7 III. So when you crop in on that 4K footage, you've got double the resolution there, and that does make a difference. Now, again, I'm not saying it's a better video camera. It's not. But that is a feature you don't have really, or a capability, not a feature, a capability you will not have with this camera. But part of why I mentioned wanting to see the menu system really reflect the Xperia line is not just, again, for the touchscreen being better or larger. It's making the camera smart. This is something that in 2020, I want Sony, come on, you can do it. I know that Sony can do this. And I mean, scrolling through this, it works well, but there's no reason we can't have something that is fantastic and not just something that works well. So they've come a long way. Like I said, I feel that the new menu system and the touchscreen is a starting point, but not having these cameras specifically here in 2020 be smart is, to me, a pitfall. And I know for most the tool is the tool and they don't need it to be smart, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that Sony has the technology. They can deliver this. It seems to be an option that they're just not exercising, I'm assuming because of cost and it eating into margins, which is understandable. They need to stay competitive. Canon, we thought, was breathing down their necks. Of course, we now know that Canon is, as usual, breathing down its own. But when you look at what Sony has here versus Panasonic or Canon, forget about Nikon, I mean, Sony is alone. So that's part of the reason I feel like they get away with, again, a menu system that really could be amazing. And this is the start, but we're just not there yet. So while it's easier to dive through settings than ever before, being that you have quick access, I mean, you couldn't do this. You can't do this with any of Sony's other cameras. I still think that there is so much more polished, and it's time for them to change the game rather than just alter what they had existing. And they got to do it. It's kind of like how we waited forever for dual band Wi-Fi on one of their cameras. They finally did it, but it didn't change workflow because they didn't give us really the capability with software to fully leverage that. So I want to see Sony flesh that out, and I feel like a camera like this being so amazing in terms of what they have been able to pull off with internal recording capability, it again just seems like a no-brainer to match that amazing tech with a display and menu system that is of like capability and quality. And we just don't have that. So many marks and steps of progress have been made here, and I'm giving Sony complete credit for all of those. But I know what they're capable of, they know what they're capable of, and they can deliver it to us. So a lot to like here. The a7S III is, without any hesitation, again, the best camera of its kind, best EVF. The autofocus system is the best that I've seen on anything that shoots video. So if you want to use something that can shoot auto flawlessly, track subjects flawlessly, and give you colors that straight out of camera you can get away with because they are that good, Sony's done it. And they're not known for delivering that. But that all started with them, bringing that real-time tracking and giving us eye autofocus in video in coordination with real-time to eventually yield this product, which is amazing, no question about it. Overheating, not an issue. Again, I don't know if over time lifting the threshold is going to be a problem, but long format, I did record several hours without an issue. That is turning off the overheat threshold. And as I mentioned, a lot of people think that it's just about how hot it gets to the touch. I really hope that's the truth, because it would be a horrible thing. And I don't think Sony would do that, by the way, to users. Sony's very good about listening to users, taking their feedback, incorporating it into their cameras, because they know that's the way you make a good product. It's not just trying to determine what users want, it's listening to them. And Sony's done that. So I'm hoping that they're listening about what I've mentioned here. So again, the short list is bring us that Xperia smartphone tech into a camera already. We shouldn't have to look at Carl Zeiss with their $6,000 joke. And I'm calling it what it is, because it might be an amazing camera, but it's probably not going to be. And then in addition to that, give us the ability to have the bandwidth on that Type-C port to actually write to an NVMe. Give us the ability through the full-size HDMI port that you provided to capture raw video that is not just 12-bit, but 120 frames like this camera is capable of recording internally. I'm not an engineer. I don't know what limitations they faced, so I'm not going to tell you that, I'm not going to pretend rather that I know the limitations, but it just feels, as I said like 15 minutes ago in this video, which is totally unscripted if you didn't know that already, welcome to my channel, I just can't help but feel like this is about pushing a new standard, which Sony's pretty famous for flash standards, aren't they? And making us rely on it. Because again, if you want the zero compromise experience with this, you need to rock out one of these. I mean, you can, as I mentioned, spend your money on V60 and V90 cards, but this is the magic bullet, the silver bullet, whatever you want to call it. It's really the compact flash express type A. And I respect Sony that they've done this, because I do think this is a standard that going forward, you're going to see really get fully fleshed out. I mean, it's amazing. We're talking about, you know, an NVMe in the palm of your hand. But on that note, it would be an error if I did not mention that when transferring data off of this card, I've seen speeds start out at about 600 and then drop down tremendously. So I'm assuming that has to do with file size, which is something you run into with NVMEs as well. Anyone who uses NVMEs for cinema cameras, they're aware. The larger the file size, you know, once you get to a certain threshold, whether it's 1, 2, 100 gigs, you're going to see that ability, you know, the caching of what it's transferring drop off tremendously, because it just doesn't have the room, and it's going to actually start acting like basically a V30 card. And I did see that happen with this. So I almost forgot to mention that. I don't want to pretend this is perfect either, but it is the best product of its kind. If you're looking for the best way to internally capture the video that this internal capture device is really capable of, this is the way to go. It's the most expensive, but it's also the best. And it should be. Not just because it's the most expensive, but it's Sony. But again, I'm just irked by the limitations that we're still facing here. And that's why if an a7S is going to be in my future, it could be this down the road once we see flash storage really catch up with what this is capable of. And on the flip, it could be for me, as I said, in the form of the next a7S. But where I really think I'm going to be made happy is, again, with more of a hybrid experience, either with the a7 IV or the a7R5. Now, the a7R5, I think, is a year away, so the a7 IV is more likely going to be that hybrid that's going to make everybody happy from a budget and performance standpoint. Not everyone needs the resolution offered by the a7R series, so keep that in mind. Another thing that everyone should know is that battery life, which I didn't talk about at all, is fairly good. It's better than the a7R IV. So, you know, if you're shooting video, you're going to definitely notice a difference. Now, is it, again, night and day? No, it's not. It just isn't. But it's something I wanted to point out. You know, we are still working with the same battery type that is now, how many generations ago did we get it? Did it start with the a7R4? I believe it did. Or no, excuse me, the a7R3 I meant. So, I mean, this is a great thing, but I'm not saying it's time for a new battery. It took long enough to get to a new capacity, a new capability, but here I circle back to wishing that we had a faster way to quick charge the Z series. And it's out there, it's just not something Sony is willing to invest in right now. At least that's the way I take it. So when we get there, I think it's going to be a huge advantage for all of us, but we're not there yet. And that's another thing I would expect to see in the next generation of a7S. Now, that could be 5 years from now, right? I mean, it took 5 years to get this. So I'm not telling you to wait. That's not the advice I'm giving. It's just food for thought about something that is an expensive body that's amazing, but again, like the touchscreen and menu system, the lack of true smart capability on this camera, those are things I know Sony can do, and I'm waiting to see them do it. But at the end of the day, nothing's going to give you, again, autofocus color quality and true, 10-bit 4K 120 frames recorded internally. Again, that's 422 in the way that this camera will do it. And for a lot of people, that's enough said. At any rate, hope you enjoyed the full review. It's an amazing camera. It's not going to be in my arsenal as of right now, because again, it's more video camera than I need. For many of you, it's the video camera you've been waiting for, and I understand completely. And that's why, again, at $3,500, it's a bargain, especially if you already own full frame glass. Just remember, your APS-C glass that you may already own, it's only going to work, of course, for full HD. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.